Supreme Court upheld a law today that would ban TikTok in the United States beginning Sunday.
Unless the app finds an approved new owner by Sunday, then it will effectively be banned in the United States.
It's been a wild few weeks in tech. Big names like TikTok, Meta, and X are making major moves.
So will America's 170 million TikTok users wake up on Sunday morning to find their favourite app is dead? Or could it get a stay of execution? It seems
I want to talk about something important today, because it's time to get back to our roots around free expression on Facebook and Instagram.
Some big changes were announced amid huge political shifts in the US, some of them churning out moments for the history books. That timing is no coincidence. This is Business Extra, and I'm your host, Salim Saeed, business editor here at The National. In this episode, we're breaking down recent major developments happening around these social media companies and exploring the business motives that are driving them, both in the US and right here in the Middle East.
The golden age of America begins right now.
US President Donald Trump is back in office with a new spin on Make America Great Again. This time, he's aiming for a golden age, and tech is at the center of it. It's a different approach from his first term, when he positioned himself on the front lines of the then rhetorical battle against TikTok. Then, just one small element of his animosity toward China. He was among the first to suggest a full ban of the app in the US. The Chinese-owned company, a subsidiary of parent company ByteDance, raised red flags for the US government about the possibility of compromising user data. From then on, it was handled as a potential security risk. When Trump left office, efforts to ban the app quieted down, but the debate around it never really died. In 2023, TikTok CEO Shou Zichu was subjected to a congressional hearing, where he was grilled by Republican and Democratic senators alike.
Of what nation are you a citizen?
Singapore.
Are you a citizen of any other nation?
No, Senator.
Have you ever applied for Chinese citizenship?
Senator, I served my nation in
asking-
Singapore. No, I did not.
In April last year, then President Joe Biden signed a bill banning TikTok into law. TikTok took the case to the Supreme Court, the highest in the US, in a gamble based on what they saw as a violation of free speech in the US. It was a gamble that the social media giant lost.
Here's the latest on the TikTok ban.
It's official. The app TikTok is set to be banned.
To the US government, I'm never forgiving you for this.
In January 2025, the app went dark in the US, but less than 24 hours later, it was back up, with a message for all users to see.
The video sharing app said the reversal was thanks to U.S. President-elect Donald Trump, who said
users reported refreshed algorithms and the removal of some features. A few days later, some in the US noticed that the phrase Free Palestine was flagged as hate speech by the app. The future of the app, technically and legally, still hangs in the balance. And it's not just TikTok that was at the center of news coming out of the tech industry recently. At the same time, Meta was making a big decision of its own that could reshape how misinformation spreads online.
I want to talk about something important today, because it's time to get back to our roots around free expression on Facebook and Instagram.
Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg announced a major change at his company.
First, we're going to get rid of fact checkers and replace them with community notes, similar to X, starting in the US.
It wasn't out of the blue, but it was a full 180 from Meta's previous policies. Zuckerberg had claimed in August that the Biden administration had pressured Facebook about moderating certain content during the COVID-19 pandemic, and in a letter to Congress said he, quote, regretted caving into government pressure, unquote. The removal of fact-checking could be an effort to remedy that, but it's not just about content. Fact-checking at Meta was a $100 million investment just in commissions to third-party fact-checkers alone, hand in hand with a prohibition on advertisements that contained information deemed false by independent fact-checkers. The program was costly across the board. For now, Meta has said its fact-checking rollback only applies to the United States, but it doesn't seem to have ruled out dropping the program in other regions. In the meantime, it's unclear how ads, its primary source of revenue, will be affected. So what do these changes from 180s at TikTok and Facebook to Trump's newfound interest in tech mean for users, politics, and big tech? The answer seems to trickle down from the realm of business. Since the start of his second campaign, Trump had made his tech agenda known. It's a flip from the first-time President Trump, known to be staunchly anti-Facebook.
Former President Donald Trump getting suspended from Facebook and Instagram for 2 years.
Who made enemies of tech names like Elon Musk.
Well, I feel a bit stronger that probably he's not the right guy. It doesn't seem to have the sort of character that reflects well in the United States. It's just, no.
And declared virtual war on TikTok.
We're looking at TikTok. We may be banning TikTok. We may be doing some other things. There are a couple of options.
Now he's seen as somewhat of a tech savior who's vowed to turn the U.S. into a haven for stakeholders in the technology industry. In terms of fact-checking, there's a possibility it may have been deemed bad for business. Here he is speaking from the Oval Office about his newfound outlook on TikTok as a business opportunity.
They really have nothing. It's passed in Congress. It gives the president a right to make a deal or to close it. And we have 90 days to make that decision. But I could see making a deal where the U.S. gets 50% of TikTok, polices it a little bit or a lot, depends on them.
You've never had, again, this many big tech CEOs in one room watching a president being sworn in.
That's the National's Cody Combs, based in Washington. He's been reporting from the Capitol on Trump, big tech, and where it all intersects.
Well, first of all, we should back up a little bit. Compared to the last time when he was elected, back in 2016 when he won and surprised many of the pundits and pollsters, there was a little bit of a backlash. You saw some of the tech CEOs issue statements to their employees saying, we don't necessarily stand with this sort of xenophobic rhetoric. We're here for you if you need anything. We support you. We want you to continue working for our companies. We understand these are turbulent political times. This time around, you didn't see much of any of that. They just took a hands-off approach. And they don't necessarily endorse the policies or the rhetoric of Donald Trump, but they realize that he's sort of a fact of life. You have a Trump administration who says that he wants to take a hands-off approach. He wants to take a more of a deregulatory approach. He doesn't seem too concerned about AI guardrails. Some of those concerns that have been echoed throughout, AI skeptics or even proponents of AI who are a little bit concerned about it. He says, I'm not too worried about that. I just want to unleash it. What that means is there's a huge vacuum within the tech industry. So you have the heads of all these technology companies that are jockeying for a position that will give them an advantage. That's why you saw so many tech CEOs at this inauguration. It's not necessarily because they agree with Trump on everything or anything for that matter, but they realized, hey, he won the popular vote. He won the electoral college vote. Showing up is better than not showing up. Maybe it shows unity, and maybe that'll get me a little bit of influence.
Back to fact-checking, because it all plays a part in the decisions companies like Meta and TikTok are making. To get a better sense of what that part is, we'll get into a bit of the mechanics of fact-checking for social media.
I think it's important with social media companies to recognize that social media companies don't actually do fact-checking. That's the one thing that they will constantly repeat is we are not the arbiters of truth.
That's Andrew Haig, the former head of Europe, Middle East, and Africa for content curation at Twitter, before it became X.
So what they do instead is they have partnerships and programs with independent, non-partisan fact-checkers from around the world. And those fact-checkers they can be massive media companies such as AP, Reuters, AFP, but they can also be small independent fact-checking companies as well. And when it comes to social media companies, fact-checkers tend to respond to myths and disinformation based on priorities, based on the partnerships that they have with those social media companies.
People who used social media sites like Facebook in their early days will remember fact-checkers weren't always around.
The process there is very much similar to the journalistic process, and the history of fact-checking actually comes from journalism. It comes from newspapers back in the 1850s, and there's similarities with social media now that back in the 1850s to kind of the early 1900s, newspapers began to become very sensationalist as they kind of grew their audiences, and they became this public demand for more factual media, and that brought the introduction of fact-checking into the editorial process. Similarly with social media around kind of the mid-2010s, the same happened. There was social media went from being this kind of friendly, open place where people just shared what they were doing in their lives to a place where people wanted to grab people's attention.
There seems to be a pattern. Here's a clip of Meta's global business group head, Nicola Mendelsohn, speaking with Bloomberg at the World Economic Forum this past week in Davos, Switzerland.
So I know you've also been a long-time advocate of diversity and inclusion. How does that match up with some of the, DEI things that you stopped doing?
Well, I think you can see and you can observe that we're certainly in a changing political and societal changes in the US right now. So we have stopped our DEI programs. But what hasn't stopped is our commitment to bringing the very best talent from very different types of communities around the world in order that
I think if you look at when these major policy announcements have happened, they've often happened with the changes of government. When it's back in 2020, 2021, that was the start of some of these policies, and the week before a new president is sworn in, that some of those policies have changed.
We'll be right back.
Dive into the world of arts, culture and entertainment in the UAE, the region and around the world. Subscribe to Culture Bites podcast from the National News to get a new episode every Thursday.
These policy shifts aren't just affecting the US. In fact, they could have an even bigger impact in the Middle East in two big ways. One is content. We're in our Abu Dhabi studio speaking to Faten Jassim, our head of data visualization journalism here at the National. She worked as the head of the Middle East curation team at Twitter before Musk bought it and made it X, and she knows a lot about mis- and disinformation on social media, particularly surrounding the MENA region. Faten, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Tell us a bit about what you used to do at Twitter.
Yeah, sure. So I was the head of the curation team for the Middle East at Twitter. And what that meant was my team was responsible for covering and responding to the biggest events in the region. And that primarily involved covering news, breaking news, sporting events, but also involved a lot of providing context to a lot of mis and disinformation that was coming from the region as well. So things like, around the COVID vaccines, things around women's health, and also mis or disinformation around particular elected officials or heads of companies and heads of state.
So you mentioned to us before that some of the fact-checking initiatives that came about at companies like X and Meta were prompted by major world events, including some here in the Middle East. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. One of the biggest one, of course, was the Arab Spring. So during the Arab Spring, we saw a huge spike and rise in disinformation from around the region. Much of it was state-sanctioned. Some of it came from smaller bad actors or malicious actors in the region. But there was a lot at the time of misinformation and disinformation that was primarily targeted at delegitimizing a lot of the protests we saw during the Arab Spring and a lot of the groups, their motivation, and what really prompted people to get out on the street to protest. And then we saw a huge spike that came as the Syrian uprising turned into a Syrian conflict. And that really involved multiple actors. For example, a lot of it was sanctioned by Russia. Some of it was also sanctioned by Iran and other regional players. So, there was a real mixture of homegrown misinformation and disinformation, but there eventually, as the Arab Spring prolonged, you got a lot of foreign kind of interference in those narratives as well. Then they really developed into becoming more sophisticated. So there was a real effort, particularly on Twitter at the time, to take down huge bot farms. And these were automated accounts, right? Much of which were, obviously they were fake. There was nothing behind them, but their main goal or purpose was to disseminate a lot of that disinformation far and wide. Because the whole idea is that you could push a lot of this information further and further up into the algorithm until, they either became trending. And so you had trending hashtags that were full of misinformation or disinformation, or they were reaching very specific target audiences. So people who were already, aligned to particular groups or had liked other misinformation posts, for example, on these sites.
And probably to drown out as well the truthful information that they didn't want people to see.
Yeah, that's right.
And can you clarify something for us as well? What is the difference between fact-checking and content moderation? And how do they compare in regulating what we ultimately see on our feeds?
one comes from the other. So even though they are separate, really fact checking comes about from the idea of content moderating. And I think content moderation is more focused on, content that is deemed either abusive, illegal, extremely violent, and it's up to the platforms themselves to discern what that looks like.
After years of having our content moderation work focus primarily on removing content, it is time to focus on reducing mistakes, simplifying our systems, and getting back to our roots about giving people voice.
And now, for example, on X, particularly now that Elon Musk has joined, most of us can tell that does look different through our feeds.
Then where does subjectivity come into play more? Is it on the fact and what a fact is, or is it more on the content moderation of like when people are being shadow banned because they say, this type of content or that?
I mean, facts are facts. There's no way around it, right? However, people who might want to, be keen to promote this idea of freedom of speech, well, they'll be like, well, listen, these guys should be able to say what they want to say without, being shadow banned or without kind of the content being taken down.
The part that's going away from these social media companies as of recent is the fact-checking, whether saying something is fact or not. But the part that's here to stay is probably still the content moderation side of, saying this opinion should be said or shouldn't. Is that correct? Or
yeah, I think, again, that's very subjective because it depends very much on the regions and the legal entities of that region. So, for example, Musk would argue that the platform X has always, even though he is promoting the idea of freedom of speech, it will abide by the laws and regulations of the land it's in, right? So, but as we know, many laws are up for interpretation as well. So, something that could be offensive to me or I might deem hateful or racist, might not necessarily be protected under particular laws. And this is why, particularly with the context of the Middle East and the Palestinian issue, it gets even more complicated, right? Because, there's been a lot of shadow banning. There's been evidence of this from various platforms, including Meta, including X. So because of that, it's becoming really difficult to understand who or what is allowed and what it isn't allowed. And really, we need to look beyond this idea of the fact-checking and think about who are the arbiters of these sites and what are their motivations, right? Because I think this is the trend we're seeing at the moment.
We tried in good faith to address those concerns without becoming the arbiters of truth.
And I'll give you one example, right? Not many people realize, but there was, during the time of ISIS and the growth of ISIS, particularly, I saw it firsthand on Twitter at the time, and how before a lot of that content was moderated off the site, a lot of those accounts were very free to share very extremist views and opinions, and they were in the process of radicalizing a lot of people, right? Now, eventually, Twitter realized that, actually, well, this is damaging. We can't have a lot of these shadowy ISIS guys on our site. So they began to block them. They even lost advertising revenue over it at one point because, there was some horrific video and imagery coming out from Syria. So I think, there was some very nuanced and very thought through policies that Twitter did at the time in which they, made some footage, not play automatically. It was behind a warning. There's different ways that you can go around this, and they labeled a lot of those accounts as extremist accounts or accounts either that were spreading mis or disinformation. So I think the thing is that we have examples of when there are no checks and balances in place, how quickly the rise of radicalization can happen. I think it's really interesting also to look specifically at, the deluge of misinformation that we've seen on Syria particularly. Now, we are seeing a post-Assad Syria and just how much of that misinformation is on the rise again. And again, it's really important because there are no or very little checks and balances currently in the region for that type of content, right? There are very few fact checkers who work in Arabic, and if they are not part of these platforms, so they're independent to them. And, we've seen on the ground in real terms that's become damaging as well in somewhere like Syria, where, there has been a lot of sectarianism, there has been a lot of tensions between some minorities and the new administration. So I think it's, without those independent fact checkers now in the region who are, taking a huge brunt and working overtime in terms of, trying to decipher between fact and disinformation. So, and I think that's what concerns me the most about where we might see a lot of these platforms heading. It's not so much, oh, I'm annoyed, I'm seeing the odd, misinformation or disinformation. It's the scale of which it is probably allowed to happen that I think could be very worrying.
With all these changes from Meta, X, and the broader social media ecosystem, what will social media look like in the future? Will truth and accountability for putting out false information be a priority for these social media companies moving forward?
Fact checkers cost money, so getting rid of that cost could be beneficial to a lot of these platforms. I think when you might see it become a real concern is if more advertisers, start moving away. We saw this happen briefly also on X when Musk first took over the site, and a lot of the advertisers decided they didn't want to advertise on X anymore. And a lot of them were scared about, the myths and disinformation that they thought would, appear on the platform, which obviously eventually it did. But it didn't seem to have much of an impact on those brands in the long term.
Thank you so much for joining us. That was really insightful.
Thanks, Salim. I'm glad to be here.
Even in the Middle East, the impacts of changes to social media are multifaceted. Changes in social media policies could signify something more, like how Trump and his partners in the region will approach tech. Now the question remains, have advertisers changed their mind about how much an untainted virtual billboard is worth? Or are CEOs like Zuckerberg confident enough that a cushion from Trump will keep them afloat? Meta's tried to reassure advertisers that nothing will change.
Have any advertisers said they worry about the fact-checking changes coming up?
Actually, what advertisers are saying to us that they've been very reassured by the brand safety tools that we've put in place a number of years ago. And we've reassured and given commitment that we're absolutely continuing to invest in this area so that advertisers are in control of where they do or don't want to put their advertising.
It's true that Meta has one of the highest-ranked advertising engines in the industry. In 2024, Meta was projected to account for just over 21% of U.S. digital ad spend, according to data from eMarketer. The World Advertising Research Center, another research organization, predicted Meta's ad spend would surpass $100 billion in 2024. Those numbers haven't been published yet. At the same time, Meta's share of the global ad market has been steadily shrinking since its Facebook days in 2013. It started its fact-checking program just 3 years later, in 2016, after Trump's first win. On the flip side, it's not clear what exactly advertisers might be thinking now in response to Meta's changes. Will advertisers still value a virtual billboard uncluttered by mis- and disinformation? Or is this a money-minded pivot by Meta and its peers away from a model that might have proved no good for business? So much is changing at such a fast pace, but one thing is certain. It's the dawn of a new era for social media, and the way the world's biggest tech moguls are running their business. Here's Cody again.
The question now is, are they actually controlling Washington? Of course, the answer to that might be frightening to some. Who's in charge right now? Is it the government or is it the big tech CEOs? The answer will determine a lot for all of us in the years ahead.
Thanks for listening. You can find more on this story in the business section at thenationalnews.com. And catch the latest from Business Extra by following the show wherever you stream podcasts. This episode was written and produced by Yasmin Attaji. Our editor, Duat Farid. Our audio engineer, Arthur Edison. And I've been your host, Salim Saeed.